Thank you so much. If you were here before, you probably have heard Ben introducing me. My name is Christhina Candido. You can call me Chris. I'm a professor with the Faculty of Architecture Building Planning. I'm also a CI on Ben's amazing linkage project that is looking to the design of school buildings. So I've been assigned with the task to moderate a panel this time of the day after coming all the amazing panels before us. So please, we need your questions and please engage with us as we go. Our panel is entitled Inclusive Design for Learning Spaces, What Can Be Done? So we're really hoping to hear from my wonderful panelists, different perspectives of what can actually be implemented or what needs to be implemented, needs to change to make sure that we see the learning environments that we all want to see kids having access to actually a reality. I don't have to tell you that inclusive design can enhance participation of all learners. I'm sure you all agree with that statement. So what I had proposed to the panelists before was for us to come from a very personal experience of their own, perceptions around what are really the sticking points, as in from, you heard before, my panel was talking about baselines and code compliance. So really from a stick perspective, what is actually really missing for us to see the change we wanted through the buildings. But also trying to think from a carrot perspective, what would be the incentives that we should be thinking about that could incentivize that change to take place. And then, of course, the timbering, or what are the case studies or what are, lessons that you have learned through your own experience that actually work. Because that's really, I can go on and on about how acoustics suck in shared spaces, but if we actually don't come up with solutions to make it better, and better yet, to actually walk the talk and demonstrate some of the case studies, through case studies that actually work, we're never going to shift, the dial on that. So that's enough about me. Today I'm joined by Caitlin Howley. Caitlin is a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Group for the Designing Learning Spaces for Diversity, Inclusion and Participation, our amazing ASC linkage. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We have Stephanie Wen. Stephanie is an educational design specialist and a partner at ClarkeHopkinsClarke Architects. Welcome. We have Mellisa Merryweather, Senior Allied Health Officer, Occupational Therapist for the Department of Education Victoria. Welcome. And then finally, Perry Rush. Perry is the Director of Inclusive Teaching and Learning, Department of Education in South Australia. Yeah? Welcome, everyone. So we're going to start with, having a few, presentations, provocations, let them speak their mind to set the scene, and then I'll ask questions, and then, of course, you're more than welcome to pop in all of your questions through Slido, because we also want to hear from you, and I would love for you to interact with our wonderful panelists. So, should I ask Caitlin to start? Yeah.
I don't have a presentation today, but hi everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I come here from in a personal capacity based on lived experience of having a disability. You might not have noticed, but I am short-statured, and that brings with it quite a few often physical accessibility challenges, and I'm really passionate about making things better for the students who come after me. I think, students spend so much of their time in learning environments, whether that be school, university, and we need to make sure that they feel comfortable, that they have equal opportunity to thrive, regardless of their abilities. And it should not be their responsibility to advocate for themselves and to always create a seat at the table in terms of designing inclusive spaces. I think we really need to work together, and being here gives me great hope that we're making progress. we really need to work together with a range of stakeholders to make these things happen and make change and really ensure that there are equitable opportunities for students of all abilities to learn and grow and thrive. Thank you.
Stephanie.
I think as a starting point, so as thanks for the introduction. So as an architect working with ClarkeHopkinsClarke Architects, we've been designing learning spaces for the last, myself for the last 20 years. And I think to everybody's point today, our understanding of inclusive design keeps evolving over time. I think to Evan's point, this just before, inclusive aspects of inclusive design that we thought were best practice 10 years ago, we are constantly sort of questioning and learning from, I suppose, listening to what the feedback is from people with lived experience, but also with our students and teacher cohort, and that's actually really informed sort of the progress. So we do a lot of work in special needs settings, and over the years, it's been great to see the progress in terms of the understanding of sensory needs, the understanding of how different people perceive spaces differently, and it's allowed us to also incorporate some of the feedback that we receive into mainstream settings. So it's been, I suppose, a really positive journey. So I think we've also experienced positive failures, which I think is a term that some of us really related to, because those positive failures really lead to better innovation and progress as we all learn to design better for everybody. So these are some projects where I suppose inclusivity was the focus, and the understanding of sensory needs. We've tried to incorporate some of the learnings as much as possible into those mainstream learning settings. And another aspect of the progress we are making is learning with allied health professionals and getting their input right from the start of the project. And that's not always something that's included in the processes, in the design processes that we are, I suppose, that we're given. But I think it's something that we are kind of actively advocating for, and it's something that sort of relies on us really to take the initiative, even when we are putting a bid for a project, to say, well, this is actually what we think needs to happen, and this is what we're proposing. And the learnings from this process has been great and has allowed us to really evolve our design. So this is an example, an officer specialist school. And I suppose what it's showing is the figures that you see on the plan, sort of the different ways or different options for self-regulation that's provided within the learning environment, just outside the learning environment, as well as outside of the learning environment. And I couldn't help but sort of wonder how would our experiences have been different. I mean, it's probably all of us. If, for example, this very space where we are at now allowed for people to be able to participate in this session, while being, for example, in a space where they could also be more comfortable. So a smaller zone, for example, that could have been adjacent to this or within, so first within this space, adjacent to this space, and then we know that we've got the sensory room on level 4, but then that actually requires you to sort of remove yourself from that learning environment. So I couldn't help but think that our experience could have been very different if we had that access to, whether it's, fresh air and an outdoor space, opportunities to learn differently in that big auditorium. And lastly, I think in terms of how we are learning and how we're progressing, and I think that's something that everybody's touched on, is that idea of co-designing with users. And I think even from that, even if we've been doing this for the last 20 years, I think we are constantly trying to question ourselves and also sort of, I suppose, try to enable greater participation from all students in even the way that we may conduct those workshops, understanding that not everybody would be, for example, comfortable in a large setting. Not everybody would be able to verbalize their needs. And how can we actually allow all students to be participating in those sessions? And that is also something that we need to advocate for, even when leadership groups are putting together student working groups. Who are the students who actually represent the voices of their cohorts? Quite often, the easy solution is to send through their leadership groups, because they'd be the most vocal, they'd be able to verbalize very articulately some of their needs or some of their feedback on their existing spaces. But I suppose the challenge is to make sure that we have a diversity of voices, and that everybody in our sessions are able to sort of participate. For example, by placing a little card in front of you rather than having to verbalize the feedback that they want to give, or sort of explaining their desires and aspirations for new spaces. Thank you. Pass on to Mel.
Hi, everyone. I'll just have to get all these things going. Cool. So I'm just going to talk to everyone a little bit about my experience as an occupational therapist. Now, I think we have a couple of occupational therapists in the room today, which is really nice, but also, I don't know everybody's level of engagement with occupational therapists. I know traditionally you might have seen us in a hospital or in a rehab setting, but we do work in schools and in education settings. And so I thought I might just spend a couple of moments talking about that and the way, we kind of think and frame things, and maybe leave it to you guys to reflect on how that's helpful in an architecture or design space. But here we go. So, and again, a lot of you are researchers, so you'll probably love the Venn diagram here. But this is a person, environment, occupation model. And this is, a really simple frame that occupational therapists use to kind of, a way that we apply our work. So the person that you can see at the top here in the purple with the figure, we think of a person, they're a human being with qualities, attributes, abilities and skills who is able to take part in many roles. And what we know about a person, this is their likes, their dislikes, it's a person's beliefs, their values, their characteristics. It's also important to recognise that a person is ever-changing and developing and interacting with the environment while they're performing many occupations and roles. So occupational therapists, sometimes we can work at that personal level, maybe building a student's skills, and an example of that could be working at, supporting fine motor skill development for handwriting. The green one occupation that is not just a person's job. We think of occupation as an activity or tasks that are meaningful and purposeful to a person to meet their needs. So your occupation or your role as a self-carer, a learner, a student, as a friend, as a sibling. And occupations are essential for living. So if we're thinking about this level and how occupational therapists works, we might be thinking about how do we modify a task or that someone has to do to engage participation. So an example, someone may prefer to use dictation rather than typing. Lastly, which I'm sure you're all interested in, is the environment. We think of the environment, it's very broad. It is the physical environment, but it is also the social, cultural, institutional, and socio-economic domain. The environment is the context in which the person takes part in their occupations, and occupational therapists really think about the ways that we might need to adapt the environment and support a person to carry out their occupations. And I think that's probably what's going to frame a lot of the discussion today. That little point of intersection in the middle there, we call that occupational performance. So this is representative of how the person, the occupation and their environment all fit together. And we want that to be a really good fit, because when someone has optimal occupational performance, you might consider that, they're able to do what they need to do in the environment and be themselves. Bear with me, this looks a little complicated, but I just really wanted to illustrate that idea of the person, the environment and the occupation changing over time. And in a really practical sense, this image is showing that interaction over a period of time. So if you have a look at that first section here, we might imagine that to be a neurodivergent child at a really early stage of their life, and they're at home, they're with their parents, they have their bedroom, they have all of their sensory needs met, they have people who know them well. We can see that overlap is really high. They have optimal occupational performance. As we move to the next section, if you imagine that child, that neurodivergent child has now transitioned to school, and all of a sudden they are faced with lots and lots of change, particularly in the environment and in their occupations. So there's lots of new things that is happening to a person, and we can see their occupational performance has shrunk a little or a lot. And so the important thing that we want to do here is how do we work together to make sure that fit, is a lot stronger. How can we have that person or that young person engaged in schooling and doing all of the occupations that they need to do, being a learner, being a student, being a friend. I think that point of intersection, the last section there might be representative of when we've made some changes, whether that's to the environment or to the occupation, less so to the person. But that's what we want to try and achieve, a better fit as we move across time. So, and just lastly, I think that I wanted to just talk a little bit about sensory processing. This is something that I'm really passionate about, an area that, I've kind of always been diving into and curious to know more, and it's an area that OTs can have a lot of expertise in. Many people over the past 2 days have talked about sensory processing and the needs and challenges in getting that right, but I just thought it might be nice to take a moment, do we all kind of understand what that means in terms of neurodivergent individuals? And so I think it's important to recognise that everybody has sensory preferences and everybody has sensory differences. It's just that maybe if you're neurodivergent, those experiences can be quite different, and unfortunately maybe environments can really exacerbate some of those sensory processes. So it's also that's part of the person, that's part of who they are. We don't we can't change someone's sensory preferences. There was a time when maybe we thought about desensitization and things like that, but I think we're really lucky to live in a time where we don't think like that anymore. We want to harness someone's sensory preferences as a strength and something that we can, support their learning. So, we do have all the 5 typical senses, but also there is the interoceptive sense. That is your internal sense. It tells you whether you are hungry or whether you are cold or whether you are hot. For an autistic individual, they may not fully recognise that, and particularly for young autistic people, that's really hard for them to know. So, significantly impacts the environment that they're in. Your proprioceptive sense, how close you are sitting to the person next to you. Is that really bothering for you, or is that totally fine? Some people love that. Some people prefer space. Your vestibular sense, so your sense of balance. If anyone's, travelled in a plane, when the plane takes off, that's your vestibular sense working. They're the senses and the 3 extra ones that OTs think about. And lastly, I've just got a couple of what can you do about sensory preferences and support in the classroom? So, it's, there are lots of things that we can do to support someone's sensory preferences. It might be a simple change, but this change can be the difference between a student being able to sit in a class and engage and learn something and be happy and less anxious, or them just walking out of the room completely and missing, a really enriching learning experience. So it's very important to think about how can we, have space or limit odours. Do they have spaces for someone to decompress? And I really like what Stephanie said. They might be able to meet their sensory needs and still stay in the learning space. Often the separate space isn't always the ideal situation. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to give you a bit of context, teacher and principal of 33 years, was fortunate to be in a position as the president of the New Zealand Principals Federation for a couple of years, so deeply connected to practice-based perspectives. And I want to share a couple of those perspectives today. It's going to be really hard to talk about my perspectives without having your help to do a bit of time travelling. So if it's okay, I'll get you to help me do that. So I'm going to take you back to 1999.
Oh dear.
When I was deputy principal at this school in northern Wellington. So if you could help me do that, I'd appreciate it. It's simple. It's just 3, 2, 1, 99, and then I'm there. So is that okay? Just as loud as you can. So it's 3, 2, 1, 99. Okay, let's go. So I bumped into Alistair. I used to teach Alistair at the primary school before he went to secondary school. It was a windy day on the streets of Wellington. I was walking down the street and I saw him approach me, and he saw me. And this big grin crept over his face, and he came towards me with his hat on, and he said, "Hey, Mr. Rush, how you going?" "I'm going okay, Alistair. I'm going good. Great to see you," I said. "How's school going?" Now, I have to tell you, when Alistair left me, he left with a sparkle in his eyes. He was a brave young man, amazing rugby player. He could play the guitar incredibly, fantastic at drama, wonderful dancer. He was one of those kids that had that vim and verve of his personality. Yes, he was dyslexic. Yes, he struggled with his core reading, writing and his maths. ADHD. He had some challenges, and he worked really hard to overcome those challenges, and he left me excited about high school. So come on, Alistair, tell me how it's going. How's school going? "Oh, I hate it, Mr. Rush. It sucks." "What do you mean it sucks? Tell me what's going on up there." "You see, Mr. Rush, when you get to high school, you do those tests." "Oh, what tests?" I asked knowingly. "Well, you see, Mr. Rush, you do those reading tests, you do writing tests, and you do those maths tests." Oh, yeah. And how did you do on those tests? I didn't do very well, Mr. Rush. And they stuck me in the veggie class. The veggie class. Yeah, Mr. Rush, that's the class they stick the kids in that don't do very well, and you get all the stink teachers. Right, jump out of 99 and back to present. I don't tell you that story to depress you, but it depressed the hell out of me at the time. Because the very construct that exists in our society that is meant to impassion and nurture and grow and enthuse and wrap our arms around every single young person was the very construct that mitigated against that happening. It's a wonderful professor in New Zealand, sadly passed away, Professor Graham Nuttall, out at Canterbury University. And Graham's lifelong research really is around the lived experience of young people in classrooms. And his research is just stunning. It's one of my favourite bodies of research, replicated many times over the years. And it points to the power of teachers or the teaching workforce's socio-cultural norms. So Jodie, I'm connecting to your work here. The power of those norms and how pervasive they are in the culture of schooling. Now, I want to call that out just at the start of our discussion today, because it's very important when we're in a space of wanting to and being enthusiastic about growing inclusive schooling that we understand the struggle we have to do that successfully. Schooling is very pervasive. The structures, the routines, the shape, how it works is in many ways a very immovable notion. And I say that respectfully because I think brave people are moving it. And that's the call I think I really want to point you to today. Things like timetables, things like classrooms, things like schools in the burbs, things like one teacher per group of kids, things like age cohorts, things like curriculums that sit on shelves that important people decide you must learn. These are all things that we come to accept as norms in schooling, but they don't have to be. Graham's research points out this reality very decisively. He points out that these norms exist because when we're novices in teaching and learning, we tend to assume that these are important parts of the system. So we practice these behaviours to the extent that they become normalised. And then over time, those norms are just passed forward. And part of our challenge is to say, let's change, let's think differently. Let's consider what is important to meet that challenge of diversity and how we grow difference. I'll give you 3 examples of how this has found form in my career. Just after 1999, after Alistair, I launched the City Site classroom in the middle of Wellington CBD, which was a satellite class for our senior students, based in a high-rise that I'd begged off the ANZ Bank. I begged the floor off them and said, can I bring my kids into town and can we just work from this place? Can I use the city as a classroom? Can I teach the kids a trust license and can they get out into the city without me having to hold their hands? Can they take a cell phone? And yes, it was one of those brick Alcatels that sat on your belt, you know, the big ones like bricks. Can they keep in touch with me and let me know where they are in the city as they go and work with businesses or visit places that support their learning? Can I be back in the city class supporting the growth of their literacies and across the range of capabilities? Yes, I could. Could we make that happen? That ran for 4 years. Off the back of that, we opened a brand new school in the heart of Christchurch, Unlimited Paenga Tawhiti. I was the foundation director there. A whole school that had the founding document being driven by young people's passions and interests driving their learning. That was really exciting. A way of taking curriculum and letting young people have ownership of what drives their learning, not the dusty off-the-shelf stuff that sometimes curriculums can tend to communicate. Secondly, In South Australia at the moment, we have tailored learning. This is a new program of learning that we've introduced that picks up a young person and legitimises their schooling if it's not on site, if it's somewhere else, and there's a good reason for it, then it's a legitimate form of schooling. And how do we make sure that that is resourced and seen as appropriate? So how do we diversify our notion of what constitutes schooling? It's not just the boxes down the road. It can be other things. Thirdly, I'm thinking of Waimarie School in Christchurch. Now, Dr. Julia Aitken, the wonderful Australian academic, worked with Waimarie. They took a view that they didn't want to have learning commons and learning neighbourhoods that had home bases that young people could go to work in smaller groups or work with their teacher. Their view was that they wanted to create sensory spaces that were important communities for every child in the school. So their main organising construct were those home bases that young people then moved out into the learning commons if they wanted to collaborate. It was a flip of the common notion of what constitutes open learning or collaborative learning. Instead of starting with the notions of collaboration and breaking out into smaller protected spaces, it was a start with the smaller protected space, nurture the sensory well-being and the relationships of that community, enable the teacher to be successful with explicit teaching and learning, and then enable a breakout into collaborative spaces if that was important and if it was chosen. A really exciting opportunity. And I'll finish, I think, with just a call out on something I've been looking for across our last 2 days, but I haven't found very successfully. And I say that respectfully because it's not found often in conversations about inclusion. And that is what constitutes teaching and learning that is associated with powerful inclusion. It's important, isn't it, if we're talking about schools, that we talk about the very practice that we want to see taking place in schools, and that is the quality of the teaching and learning provision. And we're not talking enough about what that specifically looks like. Because if we can identify the specifics, then we can think carefully about how design can help solve those problems and opportunities. So there's a really rich conversation, I think, ahead of us as a profession about how we get clearer about those practices associated with inclusion. And happy to talk about some of those over the course of the next half hour, 40 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
All right. How do I follow up on that? I don't know. I thought, as a mom of a primary school, I thought you were going to say 6, 7 when you started talking about the numbers. Now, a lot of you touched upon a few topics, as in, the need for adaptability, flexibility, responding to needs. But we are very much within a system all the way from the, regulatory framework to the way that we design buildings that's actually trying to keep us within, an average or what is considered a baseline, or even from an indoor environmental quality conditions that never change. So the air conditioning now is set at a temperature that makes me very uncomfortable, but is definitely meeting what standards would recommend. I guarantee you I measured in this building. This designing to what is the typical or the average is really what gets us, right, isn't it? Because it's also the definition of exclusion, right? So as a mom who was at the UN in 1 week advocating to have regulatory frameworks globally for indoor equality across buildings on the basis that that's an accessibility issue that is invisible, all the way to the following week being the principal's office of the school my daughter's going to go to, complaining about the requirements about hair. My daughter has curly hair. And what they have there is done for people who have straight hair. So, of course, I went all the way to the principal and said, that's not going to work, man. I have a life. So from a regulatory perspective, all the way thinking, end of town, all the way to what the schools can actually do, what would you put forward as something that you think would definitely change and nudge, this conversation just a little bit forward. It can be very small, as me going complain about the, expectations about hair, to the way that we actually mandate things at a government level. From your experience, what would be a small, big thing that will make a big change?
It's not something that hasn't been discussed in this symposium, but I think having the voice of various groups, including people like Mel, who works, for example, for the Department of Education as an occupational therapist. I was surprised that she had actually never talked to anyone from the Victorian School Building Authority. So there's an opportunity here for people from her team to really be influencing all the policies that architects have to work under, all the standards and regulations. We get, for example, new guidelines that perhaps, may, if not considered thoughtfully, could, I suppose, bring inclusivity sort of backwards because it hasn't potentially been thought through from the start of the process. So making sure that whether it's allied health professionals or student groups or people who have actually been principals and, have actually got the lived experience of also dealing with students with complex needs, how much have their input been taken on board when these standards and guidelines are being put forward? The other thing is around, I suppose, even from setting the brief. So we've talked a lot about co-designing through the process, from the design process, but how about co-designing from the brief, from the inception of the project? How are we getting the voices of, again, Mel's department? So Mel works for the Inclusive Education Division of the Department of Education. So, you would think that, that their input would have been, it feels it should have been a given, but it's not. So how can we actually, we'll keep talking, but how can we actually facilitate that and make it, as I suppose, more accessible to everybody who wants to be able to tap into their expertise and experience, but also make sure that from the outset, the standards and guidelines that is going to impact on how we design in the next 5 to 10 years, and and that in turn is going to have profound impact on how student cohorts experience schools and whether they decide to go to school or not. It's a small, something that needs to be thought of from the start, getting the right voices when we formulate those briefs and standards.
Just as you asked the question, I remembered the marvellous TED talk done by Sir Ken Robinson, How Schools Kill Creativity. Do you remember watching this? If you haven't seen it, it's one of the best. Because Ken's cry, his call out 20 years ago, 2006, that wonderful TED talk, 20 years since then, his call out was on the ecology of what it means to be a human in schooling. And his call was around his concern that schooling's purpose was to produce university professors. That we tend in our education system to educate the head and then one side of the brain, the left. And that tends to be how we go about dealing with education. Now, there's absolutely everything right about university professors. But of course, there's so much else, isn't there, in terms of the capability of our young people. So how are we supporting a rich, full picture of what it means to be human, and how are schools adequately supporting that? And it really concerns me that we still have, in just about every education system around the world, things like NAPLAN, or in South Australia, SACE, the South Australian Certificate for Education. Every state or territory has this. These formal qualifications that tend to focus on literacy and numeracy as the high tide mark for success are certainly important, of course. But what Sir Ken calls out is all of the other things that are important too. And how do we help find and build and be an education system that embraces the whole child?
All right, so trying to echo some of the sentiment in the questions here, which relates to some of the questions we had discussed before, is if we go from the baseline, but really thinking about what you think like best practice. So I think when we're talking about designing for diverse sensory needs, it should be the baseline, but that is still considered something that it's the next, isn't it? So do you have examples, through your own experience in designing the spaces, trying to run schools and your lived experiences that actually made a huge difference, but it's still considered best practice?
I guess for architects as well as the educators and leaders, there is always the challenge of how can the spaces that we create cater for individual needs, but also take into account the wider cohort. And I think, again, it's something that has been discussed today, but the simple things of, spatial variety and providing the different options so that people have the choice is sort of what we can do. So if you were, if you didn't feel comfortable in this large auditorium, that you could participate in a different sort of setting or environment, for example, that you could have, your comfort needs might be different. You might have, giving choice to people and giving that agency. And often that's sort of what students are telling us when we talk about the existing spaces, what I suppose make them feel supported in their learning environment is that they have the ability, they have the agency to change things around or move somewhere else or sit somewhere different or lie down if that's what they need at the time, because we've all talked about evolving needs across the day. Sometimes you might need, some people need to be a little bit more active to be then able to bring themselves to their best self for learning. And some people might need, a little bit of outdoor space, different needs. So all we can do really is to provide the choice and the different spaces that are carefully considered to, I suppose, to provide those different types of experiences.
Mel, on that, there is a question coming from the audience specifically asking you.
Okay. I can speak a little bit maybe to the
go ahead.
question that you just said. I guess I would just like to maybe make a couple of points, particularly around, sensory processing. And, we've touched on it at various points in panels today, but around needs and wants. And sensory needs are really valid. They are real things that people really need. It is not a fidget toy. It's not just something to hand out and hopefully that will solve all of your problems. But I think it is really important to kind of start with the place that recognise that they are valid and you are meeting a neurological need for someone, and it's so important. In terms of schools, I think some of these differences, not just for sensory needs but all needs, they should be celebrated. That's maybe architects, and designers can provide the space for that, but schools and leadership, teachers, everyone in a school has a role to play in celebrating difference and diversity. So I think having those things available and having them available to everyone, and no one being, ogled or eyed out because they use them is definitely a big part of it, because, like we've heard lots of times before, if it's essential for some and harmful for none. So there's a big part of that if it's accessible, but also the way the teacher might create the culture in that anybody can use it at any time. You don't have to ask for permission, and it's okay if, you want to use it at the end of the day or the middle of the day, or it's not just about being accessible, but trying to create a culture where that's just the accepted norm, is that we have fidget tools and different alternative seatings, or if someone needs to take a toilet break, that autonomy is valued and respected. So as much as it's in the design, it's also in that teaching and learning space, and how we make sure that students all feel safe to utilise the things that are available to them.
Caitlin, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'd love to just add, I really am a big believer that inclusivity should be the norm, and we need to also recognise that learning environments for students, it's not just the classroom, it's the playground, it's every environment that they interact with for hours on end during the time they spend at that location. So you asked for examples. One kind of different example, I guess, speaking from lived experience here, is that when I started primary school, I was fortunate enough to be at a school where the teachers really wanted to work with me and with my parents. And I think communication can be a really key challenge, but it doesn't have to be. It's just a matter of acknowledging that we're all learning, that, someone who doesn't have the disability or specific needs that you have, they might not be able to identify a challenge that you experience every day. So one tangible example is that in the playground there were these little stepping stones, and I kind of wanted to be able to play on them like the other kids, but they were just too far apart for me to use. So they actually implemented little kind of intermediate stepping stones so that I could, and they were just part of the playground, and they're still there. So that's an example where it's not in the classroom. It's not really an architectural feat, but it's just a small kind of lower cost thing that can be implemented, which made my lunch times accessible in a way that blended in with everything else that was already there. So I think we need to think beyond the classroom, and I really echo what you said, Perry, as well. It's not just the classroom, it's everything else as well, and it's the way that the teaching is delivered too.
Thank you for that. I think continue with you. So one of the questions was, the role, and for everybody else on the panel, the role of students themselves in this process, because we're now we're here sitting talking about, standards and how we design, but how can we actually harness? They are the end users of that space, right? Across the whole environment. So where you see the potential to engage them through, the different stakeholders that are participating in this event. Yeah, if you want to.
I think, and this has been raised by pretty much everyone on the panel, there's potential to engage a range of stakeholders at every step. So the the co-design needs to happen as much as possible from the beginning. And that's not always, I recognise that's not always possible. We do have budget constraints. Sometimes, it's just not possible if it's a research project and there's ethics approval to consider.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
But as much as possible, because that's the way, ultimately, the student is the end user, right? And historically, our learning spaces were being designed for the majority and their abilities, but we need to work out how we can achieve that balance of whether it be modifying an existing space in a way that enables students of different abilities to participate fully in the way that they wish to, or whether it be designing a new space. There we have the opportunity to get it right. And getting it right might not be you get it right the first time. It might be a positive failure, as you mentioned, Stephanie. And I think there we need this kind of evaluation process where the experience of students with diverse abilities, and we need representation from kind of as much as possible diverse abilities, kind of feeds back into the design, and then we learn things that enable us to, tweak the design that was created, or we learn things for the next design that is created. So I think there's lots of opportunities. We just need to identify and make the most of them.
Yeah. Okay. I think to this about engaging students, I just wanted to maybe hone on a bit of a niche area, and Stephanie talked about it before, but I've heard some lovely examples, and it's a good way to think about how we are getting feedback and input maybe from young people and students who don't have a voice. It might not be a simple interview, and talking to them, we might have to dig a little deeper and go a little bit, do a little bit more and go in that extra mile. But it's also not hard, and thinking about different ways that you're going to get your feedback. Stephanie had some lovely pictures up there where students have drawn images of what they've liked. Yesterday, I was in one of the research presentations, and they talked about doing a sensory walkthrough, and that sensory ethnographic walk. I thought that was really wonderful, where they observed how the students used the space after a period of time. If you are working with students with complex communication needs, you might need to bring in tactile examples of the materials that you're thinking about using. Are there opportunities for the students, to have a fabric sample? Do they like the texture? Do they like the colour? How are they indicating yes or no? Someone showed that they just had like a little fluffy octopus, and they could flip it where it said a smiley face or a downward smiley face, like so simple but so practical. When you are engaging students, I think it's always good to just have a think about, again, the diversity and the opportunity, the way the student, you're going to get that information and extrapolate the information from the student and their families as well. We probably haven't talked enough about the families, but families play a huge role, particularly for younger students, in the early years. It's definitely, there's lots of ways to harness, that engagement.
And I just want to underline the very deep handhold between pedagogy and design, and it's not the case that design drives inclusive practice. It's absolutely the case that great inclusive teaching and learning can happen anywhere, even in conventional classrooms. Some of the best teachers in terms of their embrace of difference have been in conventional classrooms. And some of the worst approaches I've seen have been in very open, mellifluous, and engaging environments that are that protect the sensory space for young people. So, and the converse is true. I think the challenge is, how do we line up powerful pedagogy that is inclusive with spaces that support inclusivity. That's the sweet spot, and that's what we want to drive for. So it's really important. I don't want to leave today without underlining the importance of us thinking carefully about the practice of teaching. Professor Gert Biester calls out the learnification of education. The learnification is around the focus on the student, and it's been appropriate that we've focused on the student. For too long, teaching has been about the teacher and practice of teaching. But we've got to be careful we don't forget that we need to help our workforce understand the practices associated with powerful, inclusive teaching. What are they? Let's describe them. Let's help our workforce develop them, practice them, deploy them. We don't do enough of that. Last thing on teachers for me, our ITE, our initial teacher education, is very poor in this space. Let's be honest about it. Very poor. There's very little training for our teachers as they learn their trade in the space of growing deep inclusive understanding. And it's got to get better. It has to start there in terms of the workforce. That matched with design is going to have a tremendous impact, but that's really important.
That's a great point. So if we take one of the questions from the audience, because I have to do that eventually, if you could change one thing, and the person wrote especially, but I'm going to say in general, in schools to make them more inclusive, what would be your pick? It can only be one. So think about it.
Well, look, first cab off for me is we've got to deal with universal practices and sort of tier one practices. How do we grow in our workforce for every teacher a really good solid understanding of how to meet the needs of different learners and the most important pedagogies that unpack that. So that's really about professional learning, training and development. That would have a massive impact for me. And then, as I've indicated, wrapping around the sorts of schools, the sorts of learning environments that support that and support young people and all of their diversity is a critical challenge. But yeah, those two goals are really up front for me.
What would I change? I'm a really
What is top of your list?
practical person. I'm like, oh, could we just get dimmer switches in every classroom? Could we just, can we have the blind, to make them open and close for natural light if people want? Can we magic some more time for teachers somehow so that they have opportunities to learn about this? Having accessibility. I think for educators, I shouldn't have said educators, to have opportunities to, hear lived experience, maybe from people who've been to school before, not just the students in front of them, but to have time to understand their students, to learn about them, to know their individual needs, and then to be able to do that in the classroom. It's a really big ask in a crowded curriculum. We can't ignore that. So if we could magic some extra time, that would be great. But if, again, that's a policy leadership. Dedicating time is something that would, and making it a focus. It needs to be in your strategic plan. It needs to be in your AOP. It's front and centre of where the school is going in their direction.
I suppose that's a tricky question because all schools are different depending on different models and different pedagogies. I think in general, if you wanted to make an improvement on a school, it would be, I think, to Perry's point and everybody's point, is the learning environment by itself is not sufficient. So it has to be supported by the right teaching practices, the right sort of culture around inclusion, the right funding mechanisms. It's a hard question to answer in terms of what you could change in a school, because every school is different.
Well, maybe that's it. It's like we need to approach them as being the unique set
Every
of
school is
challenge.
unique. Every school can improve in some ways. And so, yeah, I don't think it's a clear answer to that. Yeah.
Completely.
I agree that is a really difficult question. But to add on to your point, Stephanie, I think we also need to bring it back to every student is unique. So it might be that if we could only change one thing, focusing on beginning with dialogue. So communication, I always come back to the communication, but it is so important because first you need to identify what needs to be changed to help that student. So it might be that you're not just helping one student, but you identify challenges that they face, which are also faced by another student. And then you can implement a change. It might be small, it might be big, that helps them both at the same time. So I think it really comes back to starting these conversations, and we're doing it here, having discussions, but making these happen on the level of the school, the student, or their parents. Giving them the opportunity to say what they need, to verbalise it, to communicate it in any way that they are comfortable with, and not making it their responsibility to find a way to advocate. We really need to create these opportunities so that we avoid having a student who is uncomfortable, who doesn't have a safe space at school or uni or whatever learning environment it is. Ensuring inclusivity starts there. It starts with asking and creating that conversation.
Well said. I think we covered most of the intention of the questions I have here. Now, the audience, would you ask any questions? Put your hand up. Yep.
Well, it's not so much about a question, but a reflection. I really love I forgot your name, sorry. I really love the comment about Professor Gopi's stuff. And we've covered a lot of ground in this symposium. From architecture, from design, to flourishing theory, to systems theory. But one thing we did not talk about is learning. So what is learning? And why as humans learn? So why do we learn? I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
You challenged us to think about why humans learn and how influential that is in this conversation. It's very interesting. I'm a Kiwi, you could probably pick that. Back in New Zealand, we've just had a government tell the teaching profession that flexible learning environments are over. That we are into the science of learning, as I'm sure you've had some direction around here in Victoria, and most jurisdictions around the world are heading in this direction. But our government in New Zealand has said no more flexible learning environments. They don't work for the science of learning. So we've gone from almost total embrace of flexible modern learning where collaboration is at the heart of learning to a much more directed didactic model that supports the teacher and memory and practice and recall. So there is a really big question around what constitutes the learning that is important, not just for curriculum, but important for the society that we want to grow. You know, that's the point, isn't it? That we want to be growing young people that can reach the fullest of their potential and live powerful lives. So for me, it's never about sort of one approach. It's about how do we support powerful teaching, explicit teaching, that's important. And so is collaboration. So it's not one or the other. For me, it's many things. And I think that idea of talking about learning is a really important practice and consideration of design. Thank you. Thanks for that prompt.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, and again, it's something that's been touched on before, is we understand that different people learn differently, and different people, different students perceive the same space and may be comfortable differently, and so there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And for me personally, as an architect, I suppose it's about understanding what are the various ways that people learn, and how can the spaces support those different types of learning. And as Perry said, the current drive towards standardization is something that we may be grappling, and we probably are all grappling with, because there's no one way of learning. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about what Perry said. I think so. What a profound question that you've asked. But to think about, the balance of science of learning, explicit teaching. I think the challenge, or what we need to do, is think about, there actually is good evidence around explicit teaching when you're learning a new skill, and that's completely valid. But there's also lots of evidence around, collaboration, and that's what school's about. And, thinking about occupations when you, maybe when you leave school and in other aspects of your life, you will be you might be engaged in groups. So that's also important part of learning at school. And it's thinking about, how do we create an environment that allows us to do both? It doesn't mean that students have to be sitting in a row looking at the teacher for their entirety of their school day. There may be times when that is really important and that's really necessary. If you're working with young students, you're teaching them to read for the very first time. That's so valuable. Like, they need their teacher's attention. The teacher, you want to work one-on-one with students, but there's also opportunities for group time and reflection and all the social aspects of school. And can we create a space that allows both of those things to happen?
Caitlin.
Yeah, just to add on there, I guess, like you said, Mellisa, students don't just go to school to learn. I mean, that's most of their day, I guess. But, we hope. Schooling is so important because it's impacting them and shaping them, on a trajectory for the rest of their life in some ways. It's a place, like learning environments are places where students are forming friendships, they're interacting socially, they're learning new skills, which, like learning to read, for example, that's such a important skill. And how can we make sure that every student starts at the same place? School is not a race, but we all need to have the same foundation. We need to have equal opportunity to learn these skills, which will impact you for life. And if you, again, don't feel a sense of belonging, if you feel that you can't advocate for yourself, then it becomes challenge after challenge, and it's easier to just give up. But in some ways, this traditional kind of rote learning approach where, you know, teaching is this way and we're not going to change it, it's easier to just stick with what we have as the traditional kind of approach. But creating inclusive environments, it takes time, it takes money, it takes a lot of effort, but it's so worth it in the end, because the outcomes are that you're positively impacting so many aspects of that student experience. You can't even measure the impact that the environment has in some ways. So I think, yeah, it's not always the easiest approach in terms of making something inclusive, but if we stick with it, it can have so many benefits.
He's just telling me that we have to end here. Obviously, we can stay. I learned so much for each and every one of you, so I hope the panel wasn't as painful as I thought it was going to be. I would actually say that investing in this type of environment, taking the bigger broad sense from the physical to the environment as a whole, is an investment. It doesn't cost money. It costs money not to do it. So we need to flip that conversation about, you know, the benefits of investing on it. I actually think we have a lot to gain from doing, not just because it's the right thing to do, let's start from that, but because there is a lot to be gained from at the economy level. So I think we are in between and the keynote. Is that right? Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights, and thank you so much for the questions.